Get off me, I'll put it on you,
Jeamie TKV is the new heavyweight champion of Great Britain. TKV pulled off the upset and won a split decision against Frazer Clarke to win the British heavyweight title in his second attempt at the title, and Frazer Clarke had fallen short in his third attempt at the title in this fight. This was quite a scrappy fight, but it was a fun and competitive scrap that certainly had a surprising result. The odds were pretty wide in Frazer Clarke's favour going into the fight. And it's fair to say that the official Terry O'Connor, who scored the fight 115 to 112 to Frazer Clarke, was beyond generous, or dare I say biased, towards Frazer Clarke. Jeamie TKV definitely looked like the rightful winner here, despite the final verdict being a split decision. He was deducted a point in the third round for low blows, but I'd say that in terms of points off, this was levelled out by a 10-8 round in his favour in the 11th round. Jeamie TKV did not actually knock Frazer Clarke down in that 11th round, but he had him hurt enough to earn a 10-8 there in my opinion, and I don't dish out those 10-8 rounds willy-nilly. You guys know that I score fights all the time, and I can't even remember the last time I scored a 10-8 round in a guy's favour for having someone hurt without actually scoring a knockdown. But Clarke really was out of it there. But I did score the fight 8 rounds to 4 in TKV's favour anyway, which adds up to 115 to 111 to TKV. This on screen is how I scored it round for round. None of the official judges gave that 11th round a 10-8 by the looks of it, but either way, all that matters is that the right man won, and congratulations to Jeamie TKV for putting on a good performance and winning the coveted Lonsdale belt. By the way Frazer Clarke was landing uppercuts at will and chipping away at TKV's body in the very first round, it was looking like he'd be on his way to stopping TKV at some point later in the fight. TKV did come into the fight a bit more in the second round. He landed his first big shot with a hard, tight left hook in close. First time Clarke's chin was checked in this fight. There were questions about whether or not Clarke could take a good shot after his KO loss to Wardley last year. And his only fight since that loss was his round 1 KO win over Ebenezer Tate, which wasn't really much of a test. But I'll stop now to say that taking a hit from TKV is not the best test of a great chin because TKV is not known to be a big puncher. Now, I didn't bet on this fight, but I'll admit now that I went as far to say to my pal that had a bet on Clarke by knockout that he doesn't have to worry about Clarke getting knocked out because TKV has no power. And later in the fight, you could say that TKV's lack of power certainly showed. And if you're one of those who believe that Clarke is just a shell of a man with no punch resistance at all after what Fabio Wardley did to him, then you'd think that TKV hits like a fairy after not dropping Clarke in this affair. But I don't think it's that extreme. I reckon that TKV's power is limited, but the long-term effect on Frazer Clarke's punch resistance as a result of that stoppage loss to Wardley in the rematch is very exaggerated by a lot of fans. I'm sure it had some effect, but people go a bit overboard with it. Anyway, the two men were trading in close quarters in the third round, and later in the third round, Jeamie TKV was deducted a point for repeated low blows. One might deem this unfair because Clarke was supposedly going low as well, but look at how high TKV's trunks were. Shots landed on the belt line by TKV are lower shots than shots landed on the belt line by Clarke, let's just say that. So Frazer Clarke went into the fourth round with a good lead, but the two men would engage in an inside fight with Jeamie TKV getting the better of things for the most part. TKV was clinching a lot, which isn't great. We saw the same thing from him in his failed vacant British title attempt against David Adeleye in his last outing, but he was doing damage on Clarke in there, and Clarke really was tiring as the rounds went on. The fight was messy, a lot of clinching, but some of the trading on the inside in between the messy stuff was quite entertaining. The fight was very competitive, but Clarke was fading and giving up most of the rounds as the fight went on. So it was with a minute to go in round 11 when TKV finally buzzed and knackered Frazer Clarke after probably having landed dozens and dozens of clean hooks to his jaw in the past few rounds. Clarke literally had TKV bent over the ropes to buy enough time to breathe to where he would be able to throw a couple shots back for the remainder of the round and stay on his feet as TKV pursued the stoppage. One might call it a miracle that Clarke made it out of that round, but from a more negative standpoint, you could use that as a chance to question TKV's finishing ability. And in a competitive final round that Clarke looked absolutely done for going into, Jeamie TKV ended up looking done for himself. And I don't know if anyone else noticed, but the fight actually ended almost 10 seconds early. I'm sure neither combatants had any complaints about that. Look, this was a pretty decent back and forth fight and it was a good showing for the first boxing main event on the BBC in 20 odd years, and the first British heavyweight title fight on free-to-air TV since Yuri Fury vs Sam Sexton on Channel 5 over 7.5 years ago. Both guys showed heart and did a good bit of damage to each other. Clarke was absolutely cooked and out on his feet in the later rounds, and look at that bruise / hematoma or whatever that is above TKV's right eye after the fight. You could call this fight messy or sloppy, which was definitely expected, but for those calling this fight boring, because I have seen people saying that in comment sections, what on earth did you guys expect from this? For anyone who had any healthy dose of pragmatism for how entertaining this fight could possibly be going into it, will know that what we saw last night was probably the best that we could get from these two. It was certainly better than the last British heavyweight title fight we saw, which also involved Mr. TKV of course. I like to see this precious title contested for in competitive battles with dramatic moments in which both guys show heart, and I'd say that's what we got in this fight between Frazer Clarke and Jeamie TKV. As for the unexpected result here, I know for a fact that the Jeamie TKV win here, or more so the Frazer Clarke loss, has messed up a lot of plans. From what I could tell, there were plans to have Frazer Clarke go on this nice little run as the heavyweight champion of Great Britain and become a sort of national darling. And with Ben Shalom's promotion Boxer, the promoter of Frazer Clarke of course, being on the BBC now, I did see it happening and I was all for it. Frazer Clarke is known as a very likeable guy, a family guy and a down-to-earth guy and all that, and he represented Great Britain in the Olympics and won a medal. So having him on Freeview TV defending the most historic title in the sport could have made him the modern day Henry Cooper. He could have made a few defences against decent guys and won the belt outright. And he could have been a mainstay on BBC programming, making appearances with that pristine Lonsdale belt over his shoulder, doing his bit for the public appeal of the sport in the UK. Yeah, he could have been the modern day Henry Cooper. I mean, that's the dream for British heavyweights whose ceilings are at British level. Former two-time British heavyweight champion Danny Williams expressed that desire to be a modern day Henry Cooper going into his second defence of the title.
I want to get back to the days of Henry Cooper, when you could ask the average man on the street who's the British champion, and they would know.
And Williams made that comment on a BBC broadcast in the BBC's brief return to boxing in the early 2000s. But unfortunately, any plans of Frazer Clarke being this defending British heavyweight champion heralded by the public are now out of the window after his loss to Jeamie TKV. And it's not because his chin is shattered and he'll explode and die if he takes a clean jab because of that one KO loss to Wardley. No, it's because he's failed in challenging for the British heavyweight title for the third time now. The only other man who has fell short in challenging for this title 3 times was John McDermott. John McDermott didn't get a 4th shot, and Frazer Clarke probably won't either. Oh, and Clarke's stamina is an issue of course. He showed stamina issues in his first fight with Wardley, in which the two men fought to a 12-round draw, and he showed stamina issues again this time around against a notably lower level of competition. And Frazer Clarke is 34 years old now, so I don't envisage him either increasing his cardio big time or learning how to pace himself over the 12 rounds better. So unfortunately, this loss to Jeamie TKV might really spell the end for Big Fraze. So the bad guy, Jeamie TKV, is the one who's got a hold of the title now. His loss to Adelaide for the vacant title earlier in the year was somewhat controversial, with Adelaide dropping TKV with a hard shot on the break to finish him off. There are many debates as to how fair all of that was, but what is a fact is that the British Boxing Board of Control ordered a rematch between Adelaide and TKV, and Adelaide vacated the title to not rematch TKV, hence TKV's vacant title shot against Clarke. And most people took TKV's side after that whole Adelaide ordeal, but I mean, Adelaide is very disliked by the public for the most part, so that's no surprise. But now, in the lead up to this Frazer Clarke fight, and even in the aftermath, after the win, I think that Jeamie TKV has rubbed people up the wrong way a bit. Pause. His attitude in the build-up to the Adelaide fight just seemed like he was matching Adelaide's bravado and all of that, but his attitude towards the generally liked Frazer Clarke has made TKV unlikable to a lot of British boxing fans. I'm personally indifferent, but I can understand it. And Jeamie TKV is certainly less marketable than Frazer Clarke. I reckon that's why one judge scored the fight to Clarke by 3 rounds, despite TKV being the clear winner. Jeamie TKV is with Ben Shalom's Boxer as well, but yeah, I did see the want to push Frazer Clarke as a British champ who crossed over into the mainstream, and I don't think that can be achieved with Jeamie TKV. As for Boxer on BBC, I have expressed my enthusiasm for free-to-air boxing quite a bit lately on my channel. And it's good to see that Boxer will be back on the air in 3 weeks' time with the British, Commonwealth and European super middleweight title fight between Callum Simpson and Troy Williamson. Callum Simpson is one of Boxer's biggest stars. He could definitely go on to do things at world level, and Williamson is coming off of a nice upset win for the English title. Ben Shalom's got 2 shows on 3 weeks apart from each other, yet all of the DAZN affiliated guys put dirt on Boxer's name and started talking about how Boxer apparently only had 4 slots a year with the BBC in every interview. The first Boxer on BBC show being a British heavyweight title fight between 2 Boxer guys is good, because I reckon that the best bet for Boxer is to try and keep that title in-house and have it contested for at least 3 times a year and really promote the importance of the title on TV. well, they'll have to do a better job of promoting it than they have done for the Clarke versus TKV fight going forward. Having the British heavyweight title as the main selling point of boxer on BBC shows would have been more feasible with Frazer Clarke being a defending champ, but they can still do so now with Jeamie TKV as champ. They're speaking about Jeamie TKV fighting Dave Allen next. Obviously Allen is not with Boxer, but hopefully a TKV versus Allen fight for the British title would be on a Boxer show on the BBC. I reckon that Jeamie TKV would outwork and outjab Dave Allen for a decision victory. People would pick Dave Allen to beat Jeamie TKV handily if he was in shape, but what are the odds of Dave Allen being in shape now? Then you could have another all-boxer affair for the title, Jeamie TKV versus Richard Riakporhe, and then whoever wins that fight, hopefully whoever challenges either of them for the title will come on a boxer show to do so. It would be cool if Ben Shalom could gatekeep the British heavyweight title with Boxer. You know, if he could put on enough in-house affairs, and if his guys could beat any of the Matchroom or Queensberry heavyweights who come to challenge for the title. Well, it would mainly be Queensberry guys as they have the deeper heavyweight roster. I'll tell you, Boxer are more likely to gain popularity with the British heavyweight title than they are with women's boxing. If I see Boxer doing a bunch of women's main events, then I'll be a bit disappointed. Leave all of that to MVP promotions who have monopolised women's boxing essentially. More on that in a minute. Now, that Callum Simpson versus Troy Williamson fight on December 20th, the next Boxer on BBC show, is clashing with the Misfits fight between Andrew Tate and Chase DeMoor. And let me say now, if any of you guys watched that Tate versus DeMoor fight over the Simpsons versus Williamson fight, please just know that O.M.E boxing will be really disappointed in you. I'm sure that will really bother you guys, right? I'm sure that's your biggest concern. Look, I'm not one of those Andrew Tate haters at all, but I'm a boxing fan above all else, and I know that Andrew Tate was a legit kickboxer, but that's kickboxing, a separate combat sport. He has been retired from that separate combat sport for years now, and he's fighting an influencer boxer in this Misfits fight, so this is a bona fide gimmick fight. But Simpsons versus Williamson is a proper fight for all of the old school regional belts, and it's on free-to-air TV. Let's support a proper fight on free-to-air TV over a gimmick fight behind the paywall, please. And the day before the Andrew Tate fight, there's another gimmick fight in Jake Paul versus Anthony Joshua. Jake Paul was meant to fight Gervonta Tank Davis in November, but Davis was pulled out of that fight, so now Jake Paul is fighting AJ on December 19th, in a fight that is probably scripted. I'm not even asked to talk about AJ versus Jake Paul, but seeing as I did a pre-fight video on Jake versus Tank, I will address that fight's cancellation quickly now. So look, Tank Davis was pulled out of the Jake Paul fight due to domestic abuse allegations made against him in the lead up to the fight. Now, I'm not here to discuss or theorise about the allegations against Tank because I haven't really looked into it and I don't care about Tank anymore. The guy is just a simpleton. But what I do know is that Jake Paul's outburst in reaction to the domestic abuse allegations against Tank that got the fight cancelled was virtue signalling and redirected rage at its finest from Jake Paul. And that might make me sound like some wrong'un who's dismissive of domestic abuse or violence towards women on the surface, but when you read between the lines, you'll realise that Jake Paul's frustration isn't necessarily directed at the fact that Tank was allegedly violent towards women. So let me break it down. In Jake Paul's tweet reacting to the fight's cancellation, he calls out Tank for his unprofessionalism when it comes to promotion, and separately for being a woman abuser, which is just not on as far as Jake Paul stands, given that Jake's company champions women. Now, reading this tweet, to me, Jake Paul seems more bothered about Tank being shitty and being an entitled bum when it came to fight promotion, and that he had to put up with all of that just for the payday to be cancelled. But because the reason of this fight's cancellation was the domestic abuse stuff, Jake Paul could easily use that to paint himself in a good light and speak out against that. But look, the domestic abuser or alleged domestic abuser should be the bad guy in this situation, and you know Jake Paul's hardly going to speak well of Tank after being accused of that, so Jake Paul is in the right from that front. But when you realise that Tank has been accused of and been arrested for such crimes in the past, you question how genuine Jake Paul's disdain for violence towards women is. Because he says here that he does not want to grow the bank account of a woman abuser. So it takes the third or fourth allegation or whatever it is to not want to grow his bank account. Come on man, you're just mad that he messed up the bag. And this interview clip from after his presser with AJ reinforces my theory that he only decided to care about Tank's domestic abuse now that it directly messed up the bag for him.
You know, he's reaping what he sows, but I hate working with people like that. He stands everyone up, film crews, everything, doesn't do any promotion, doesn't do any posts, but it is what it is. I'm actually glad this all happened this way so that he doesn't get the biggest paycheck of his life and just continues to be a piece of shit in boxing.
They agree with the reasoning of not platforming Gervonta Davis because of his past, but that was also present before signing the fight. So your response to that?
Yeah, I think if people have a past and they reform and they're doing better and they're on a good track, people deserve second chances and opportunities. But when you bring the past into the present and do it while we're in the middle of a fight promotion with massive company like Netflix involved and MVP being a champion of women's fighters, it just makes things a little bit different. And we, didn't know whether or not he was going to be arrested, in days prior, and still don't know. So who knows?
And don't get me wrong, I'm actually on Jake Paul's side when it comes to the whole promotional stuff. I completely understand his dismay with Tank's unprofessionalism. And again, you have the right to lambast someone who's had multiple abuse allegations made against them, if you really had a good reason to believe that they're true. But at the end of the day, you signed to fight a guy knowing that he had a history of that, and now you're just mad that he messed up the bag. You're not fooling anyone with this fake outrage. And in terms of Jake Paul's MVP promotions champion in women's boxing, let's call it how it is. MVP took over women's boxing because it's way easier to monopolise than men's boxing is. With the Riyadh season takeover, with all that Arab money, do you think MVP are going to be able to get multiple male world champions on their shows? No way. High profile women's boxing is like MVP's unique selling point. It was a smart business move for them to take over women's boxing, and fair play to them for putting it on a big platform and doing those all women's cards. But let's be real, MVP's only way into mainstream boxing was to sign up all of the best female boxers in the world and promote that, which was feasible for them because the all-round appeal of women's boxing doesn't compare to that of men's boxing at all. Man, people really do get sold the dream of Jake Paul being this saviour of boxing. They give such praise to the MVP cards, even outside of all the women's stuff, but those cards are not all that. Look, the vast majority of people on this earth don't care about boxing, and I kind of understand non-boxing people being led to believe that Jake Paul is good for boxing, but it's the people in boxing who do my head in the most. I don't really like Jake Paul, but he is great for boxing, for bringing a casual appeal into boxing and growing the sport, and he's great for women's boxing. All I hear is, I don't like Jake Paul for emotional reasons that I can't articulate, or I'm saying that part to save face and appease to hardcore fans, but I'm gaslit into thinking that his gimmick fights and mediocre cards are better in the sport all round in the long run, and into thinking that he's an angel for seeing a gap in the market and monopolising a part of the sport that people don't really care about as much. The boxing media do a lot of coverage of the big women's fights because it's good press, but let's be real, who cares? Or maybe these industry guys are just saying that Jake Paul's great for the sport because they're up his arse and looking for a payday. But I know that I will never make it big, or I will never rub shoulders with anyone significant in the game, so I'll be the one to tell it how it is. Anyway, speaking of the second boxer on BBC show, Callum Simpson versus Troy Williamson, clashing with the Andrew Tate versus Chase DeMoor fight, well, the first boxer on BBC show that we just saw, Frazer Clarke versus Jeamie TKV, was originally meant to happen on October 25th, clashing with the DAZN pay-per-view fight, Joseph Parker versus Fabio Wardley, promoted by Ben Shalom's Nemesis. Do you know what Nemesis means? A righteous infliction of retribution manifested by an appropriate agent, personified in this case by an audible cunt, Frank Warren. But then the Clarke vs TKV fight got postponed due to a supposed TKV injury, which ultimately prevented these two UK heavyweight main events clashing. TKV's injury did not seem genuine, and I theorised about the real reasons why the fight was postponed in the video in which I reacted to the postponement. But after I had already done that video, Frazer Clarke was on TalkSport and mentioned that he reckons that Jeamie TKV's camp faked the injury so that trainer Ben Davidson could be in TKV's corner on the new date. Because of course Davidson couldn't be in TKV's corner on October 25th because he had to be with Fabio Wardley for his interim title fight. So I thought, yeah, that sounds true. Maybe all of my little theories are just bullshit. But guess what? The new date of Clarke vs TKV was November 29th. Last night, and that of course clashed with the Matchroom show headlined by former Ben Shalom promoted fighter Ben Whittaker, and Ben Davidson was at that show in the corner of Cameron Vuong in his rematch with Gavin Gwynne on the undercard. So Ben Davidson was not with Jeamie TKV anyway, and now a TalkSport face-off between Clarke and TKV on fight week reinforced my belief that TKV's injury was fake so that the date of the fight could be moved for some odd reason. I interpreted that because of how TKV acted when he was asked about the injury. So maybe one of my little far-fetched deluded conspiracy theories in that video were true. Speaking of Cameron Vuong versus Gavin Gwynne 2, when the two fought this time last year, Gwynne was robbed when Vuong had his hand raised in victory. Gwynne completely outworked Vuong in that first fight and looked like he won 7 of the 10 rounds. But in this rematch, the two men had another tough 10-round battle and fought to a draw this time. A majority draw because one judge had the cheek to score the fight 97-93 to Vuong. In terms of Cameron Vuong running it back with Gavin Gwynne, obviously Vuong is a little Matchroom hype job and he won the robbery against Gwynne last time, and I don't know why his promoter Barry Hearn's son wanted Vuong to run it back with Gwynne so bad. He should have just left it.
I was excited for no reason. You should have just left it.
The two wins that Vuong gained since the robbery win over Gwynne last year and the addition of Ben Davidson as his trainer wasn't enough to make up for getting outworked by the more experienced fighter the last time out and getting a more convincing win over him this time around. Gavin Gwynne's swarming style is too much for Vuong's sort of laid-back style trying to be nice and set up these big counters. Look, good fight, but this rematch did nobody any favours, to be honest. And as for the main event of the card, Ben Whittaker versus Benjamin Gavazi, look, who really cares? This was a mismatch anyway. Nobody had ever heard of Gavazi before this fight. So the whole selling point of this main event was that it was Whittaker's Matchroom debut, because the boxing fan today has been conditioned to care more about promotions more than belt and competitive fights. I'm not some Ben Whittaker hater just because he dances and all of that stuff. I think all of that's great. And he is a proper fighter, of course, because he's an Olympic medalist. But I chose to watch Clarke versus TKV instead of the Whittaker fight because that fight was for a proper title. Look, winning world honours is the biggest achievement in the sport. And the world championships are governed by the 4 major world sanctioning bodies. The WBC, WBA, IBF and WBO. But as for the regional and contender belts that those world sanctioning bodies award, they're all bullshit to be honest. And British fighters skipping past picking up an area, English, British or European title, an EBU European title that is, to just win those random belts that the world sanctioning bodies hand out, reeks of them being a manufactured star. Reeks of the fucking shit. And obviously now that Ben Whittaker is being promoted by that cocksucking piece of shit Barry Hearn's son, I can't even say his name, he will be protected from the highly competitive domestic scene on his way to a world title shot. I do rate Ben Whittaker and he could definitely win the British light heavyweight title. I mean the current champ is Lewis Edmondson, but why risk Whittaker losing at regional level, eh? With guys in the mix like Ezra Taylor, Willie Hutchinson, Lyndon Arthur and so on and so forth. It's like Conor Benn. He's the massive British boxing star who's never even won an area title, and he's been with Matchroom from the start. He would have been in that British welterweight title scene with Chris Jenkins and Echo Esman and all of that, but instead he fights older American guys who are on the decline in fights for the WBA Continental European title, and we're meant to believe he's the best thing since sliced bread, with a bit of egg on top. Hopefully I get pleasantly surprised and see Ben Whittaker matched up with the winner of Taylor versus Hutchinson next maybe, but that still wouldn't take away from the fact that this little Matchroom debut show was just pointless. But neither the Whittaker fight nor the British heavyweight title fight really mattered last night, because over in Netherlands, Huey's Shades of Ali Fury scored a round 1 knockout over Michael Webster. That was the main attraction of the night for sure. Now, obviously, before my last video, I didn't post for like a month because I've been working on one big old documentary that's going to be over 3 hours long. No, I wasn't on a break. With the amount of work I've done for that big video so far, I could have posted about a dozen videos of this length/effort, if not more, within that 4-week period in which I didn't post. And seeing as I've reacted to a British heavyweight title fight in this video, I'll announce now that the big video will be the complete history of the British heavyweight title. I go through every champion ever and every fight for that title up until now. That may not sound awfully exciting, but a lot of fun stories do come out of a lot of the champions and a lot of the fights. And I literally do an entire documentary about Henry Cooper within the video, and a little mini documentary about Joe Bugner. That's all already written. And I do go into good detail about certain other champions too. I have enjoyed the process of writing this one. But with how long that's going to take to fully produce, with other commitments, and with other post-fight reactions possibly on the way, we're still looking at like mid-January as the time that I'll finally get that video up. Anyway, lastly, can I just say that it was nice to hear the GOAT Ronald McIntosh on commentary for the Clarke versus TKV fight last night. And you guys let me know who you think the new British heavyweight champion Jeamie TKV should fight next. And you have been listening to O.M.E. Boxing.